Peter was at Eton. And then he became a lieutenant in the King's Royal Rifle Corps. He was captured on the 26th of May, 1940. 14 officers who ended up in here were captured that day. They include Grisman David Scowfield, Martin Gilliatt, Mike Sinclair, Tony Rolt, and Hugo Ironside. He was captured in 1940 and arrived here in June 43. I believe with Cecil Merritt. Cecil Merritt?
Yes, he was with us too.
Yeah. After the Eichstätt escape, there were a large number of King's Royal Rifle Corps officers in Colditz. George Drew, who's going to be our speaker in October, by the way, he sat down in this castle on the last day of January 1944 and wrote a poem about the Eichstätt tunnel. Here's part of it. Tons of earth in little packets, packets slung on canvas bands, carried miles to be well hidden. Had to have some extra hands. First of all came David Fellows, willing stooge in every camp. Lords appeared, both John and Charlie, working in onto the ramp. The other Charlie, Peter Parker, let's not explain that. The other Charlie, Peter Parker, helped to swell this elite throng. Peter will speak for, I hope, about 30 to 40 minutes. He was, I think, in 7 prisoner of war camps in total. He will then hopefully answer some questions from the floor. So without further ado, Peter.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to offer my very personal thanks to the Colditz Society for organising this marvellous trip and for organising it so well. You probably heard talks about Colditz, about other people who've been here longer than I was and are far more knowledgeable about it. And after speaking to Kenneth Lockwood, I thought perhaps I'd talk about other prison camps I was in, which you may not have heard so much about. When I counted them up, I found that I'd been in 7 altogether. That included a brief visit of 14 days to a French prison camp at Zerst, where I was suffering 14 days solitary confinement. All this happened more than 60 years ago, and my memory isn't all that good over that period. But fortunately, my more literary friends have put pen to paper, and I've been able to refresh my memory from some of the books they've written. On my birthday some years ago, my children gave me one such book, and they thoughtfully wrote in the flyleaf, "Many happy returns." Well, I must say this is a very happy return. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. And it's my first one. Just to start the story of my tour of Europe, at the beginning of the war, well, May 1940, I was serving with the 2nd Battalion of the 60th Rifles, which is otherwise called the King's Royal Rifle Corps, in East Anglia. And we had also with us the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade. I gather that we were sent there because the War Office for some reason thought the Germans might invade East Anglia. There were two infantry regiments plus the Home Guard, our large force. How they were going to stem a German invasion, I don't quite know. But anyway, the German advance through France had started, and we were going to be sent over to France. We moved down to Southampton, where we embarked on I seem to remember the good ship Daffodil, which was one of the cross-channel ferries, and we set off one night and arrived next morning. I thought at Calais, it turned out to be Dover. And we were given our orders on the way across the channel. The information we were given seemed to be that some isolated armoured units and some motor bicyclists had sort of got through the front line and were swanning about in the sort of Boulogne area. And our job was to land at Calais, sweep them up and stabilise the line. Well, we disembarked at Calais and we grouped in the station yards or on the docks. And the odd shells seemed to come through the roof from time to time. And I thought these motor bicyclists were very well equipped. Anyway, soon it became apparent that there was rather more than a few motor bicyclists and a few tanks. And it was, in fact, General Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps, consisting of 3 Panzer divisions, which were approaching us. We didn't know this till afterwards, of course. We didn't know who was commanding them. But he had a first Panzer Division, 2nd Panzer Division, and 10th Panzer Division. And I gather now he'd left 2nd Panzer Division down by Boulogne to look after that, and advanced on Calais with the 1st and 10th Panzer Divisions. Well, we were sort of an ad hoc brigade consisting of the 2 rifle regiments, one battalion of the Queen Victoria Rifles, which was one of our TA battalions. And they'd been trained as motorcyclists in a sort of reconnaissance role. And so there were the 3 of us in a purely infantry role at Calais, plus I think it was the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Tank Regiment. And there was some elements of a light ack regiment as well there. We had no artillery at all, and that was all there were. Well, it soon became evident that the opposition was a good deal more than had been expected, and we formed a defensive ring round Calais and waited. At one stage, rather interestingly, a friend of mine appeared out of the blue, who I'd known all my life, who said, I've got some hush-hush stuff in my trucks. May I blow them up in your platoon position? And I said, be my guest, of course. And there were some loud explosions, and that was that. And I met him later at Laufen. In fact, he told me years afterwards what he was in fact commanding was a light attack anti-radar unit. And at that time, of course, nobody had heard of radar. It was very hush-hush. Nobody in the army had heard of radar except those who were making use of it. And the Germans certainly hadn't heard of radar. And it was terribly important that they never should. And of course, if you remember, in the early days, our night fighters had a very good reputation of killing Germans. And it was due to early radar. And of course, the government didn't want this to be known. And we were all told, or you were all told, that it was due to eating carrots. And that diverted the Germans' attention, it was hoped, from radar. Well, anyway, the battle raged for about 4 days. And finally, the Germans got through to what is called the Citadel in Paris, which was also the middle of, Calais, the middle of Calais. And that was where the brigade headquarters was. And the brigade commander thereupon changed his orders from last man and last round. And he saw the battle was really over. And he said, his orders were, escape if you possibly can. Well, we did our best. We were surrounded by this, two armoured divisions. And most of us were caught there. 1 or 2 people escaped from the line of march. The only 3 I know who got home to England was our adjutant, Alec Williams, who subsequently became my commanding officer in Germany later on, and finally retired from the army as a major general. There was the brigade signal officer and the brigade major, and they got to the coast. By great good luck, they found a boat which had an engine in it, and they managed to get it to work. And they got, I think, about 3/4 of the way across the channel when it conked out. But fortunately the Navy came and rescued them, and they got back to England. There were others. There were others who escaped during the line of march, and of course that's what we all ought to have done. It was quite easy to get away from the Germans then, and we were a nominally friendly country. And I think there was the problem of getting across the Channel, of course. A friend of mine, Terence Pretty, got down, I think, to the Touquet, where there was a harbour full of boats, and he tried to get into one, but he got caught by the Germans there, and he escaped several times later. But rather oddly, for a permanent escaper, he never got sent to Colditz. I think he reached the borders of Switzerland no less than twice, but never managed to get away. There's a lot of luck in this escaping business. First of all, you had to be extremely well prepared and had a good plot, but you also had to have luck as well. I mean, there was one friend of mine who escaped for the first time in Poland and disappeared from our view. And about 6 weeks later, some friend of his got a letter from Sweden saying he'd arrived there. And that was his one escape, whereas there are other people like Mike Sinclair who escaped endless times and never really got away. Well, we started our march eventually to a place called Laufen in Bavaria. We went, I forget how many, I think we marched about 15 or 20 miles a day. It seemed almost forever. And I think we probably went about 200 miles. Eventually we were put into cattle trucks. Chevaux wheat homme 40, I think was on the labels. Or maybe homme 20, I can't remember, but I think we were more like 40 than 20 in the cattle trucks, which was very disagreeable. Eventually we were moved into a passenger train, which was slightly more comfortable. They were third-class seats, or maybe they called second class. They had wooden seats, but it was like an ordinary, old-fashioned train in England, with a corridor train, except that it had wooden seats in it. And you may remember there was a rather fashionable song at the beginning of the war called Hang Out Your Washing on the Siegfried Line, which I probably was sung rather less frequently after Dunkirk. But we were travelling from France to Germany, and a young officer, German officer, who spoke perfect English, looked in at our compartment and said, "Good morning, gentlemen. You are now passing through the Siegfried Line. Have any of you got any washing?" which we thought was in extremely bad taste. But we gave rather sour smiles, to show partly that we still had a sense of humour, and partly to show that we didn't really approve of his remark. Anyway, we went on into Germany, and finally we fetched up at a place called Laufen in Bavaria, which is Schloss Laufen. It had once been the palace of the Archbishops of Salzburg. It was right on the boundary, on the river, in fact, the river boundary between Bavaria and Austria. Why it was in Bavaria, I didn't quite know, but Salzburg was very close by. It was a magnificent Schloss. I think actually the Archbishop of Salzburg were Prince Archbishops. It was a very important position. Anyway, it had been, I think, army barracks for a long time. It's a very impressive building. It had huge rooms, magnificent staircases were about as wide as half this room, and very wide steps and shallow steps. It had all been like a lot of French chateaux and schlosses in those days. But when we arrived, we were sort of cursorily searched. No one said much on us, except what we were wearing. Then the awful thing was a hair cutting. We were all shorn to the scalp. This was theoretically to get rid of lice, which we hadn't got, but partly to demean us, in fact. It really was a very demeaning process. I remember there was one officer, a very good-looking chap, who obviously rather knew it, and he could hardly bear to get as far as the clippers, and he kept slipping back through the queue. But fate caught up with him in the end, and he was shorn to the scalp like the rest of us. And we all looked simply frightful, and it was really a ghastly procedure. Of course, at that time the Germans had won the war, I mean, they defeated the Polish army, the Belgian army, the Dutch army, the Danish army, and finally the British army, in effect. And they were ruling Europe. Their allies were then Italy. And the only neutral states were Sweden in the north, and well, nominally Spain in the south, but Spain was really on their side. And you know, one really felt very dispirited. One really couldn't see how the war could end. But somehow one remained optimistic in some way or another. And the food was, I think the food can be described as little and foul. Almost nothing. We were all worn out, of course, most of us by this long march anyway. And we were pretty limp. In fact, I think the Schloss was on 3 floors. One had 2 long staircases to get to the top of it. And a lot of officers had to have a really good rest at the top of each flight of stairs to carry on. The rooms, admittedly, they were large rooms, but there was 96 living in the room I was in. And that was in 3-tier beds. It was a wooden beds stacked one on top of the other, and packed close together all the way around the room. I mean, there was hardly room to move in it. There were a few tables and a few stools, and a few cupboards to put one's very few possessions in. And the food mainly, they had very watery soup once or twice a day. The potatoes were the trouble. The cellars were full of rotting potatoes. And Oberst Fry, the commandant, said they were quite good enough for us. And I think that led to a lot of dysentery and diarrhea. And the loos were inadequate, and the whole thing was really too solid for words. And we were all pretty limp. And I must say, one must admire the few people who did manage to escape or tried to escape from Laufen. Many of us were really too exhausted to do anything. I remember, there was one chap called Cyril Luthwaite, who made an escape. He decided to escape in a swill cart. It was the habit of Germans. You might think with the hunger we were in, there was nothing in the swill cart, but the food was so foul, it was really usually pretty full. And he hid himself in the swill cart, which was taken out daily to a local pig farmer. And he got into the cart and got out all right. And it arrived at the pig farm, and the farmer got on top of the pig cart and stuck his fork in to get the stuff out. And unfortunately got Cyril in the fleshy part of the leg. And Cyril rose to the top with a shrill scream, rather like Venus rising from the foam, and set off at a brisk pace like a good straight-necked fox for freedom. And of course, this caused great excitement. Laufen was a quiet little place in southern Germany, and really had hardly been affected by the war at all. And of course, here was a real live manhunt, and the locals' hunting instinct, which everyone has, came to the fore, and there was a real good POW hunt, and off they went after him, Cyril heading for open country. And I think either he lost his direction or had no choice, but anyway, he found himself stopped by a loop of the river, and well, nothing daunted, he plunged into the river and started to try and get across it. But when he got waist deep, he realized it was going to be too deep, and he'd forgotten to learn to swim in his youth. Changing the metaphor, like a hunted stag, he was brought to land again and carted back to the town, rather like a Roman triumph. And that was the end of his escape. He fetched up here, I'm not sure whether it was the result of that escape or subsequent one. One had to have the greatest admiration for him. Oberst Fry, the commandant, had the same views as most Germans at that time, and thought we weren't worth bothering about very much. He said anyone who looks out of a window will be shot at. And there were quite a lot of shots at windows, but most of them were inaccurate. But there was one chap who, while he was opening a window, got shot in the arm. And there was another chap who was sitting at a window painting the scene outside, and he was shot in the head. And, Germans weren't sort of very worried much about that. must have been that winter, I suddenly got pleurisy. I don't know if it had pleurisy, but it's a curious complaint. If you take a deep breath or laugh, you feel as though somebody stuck a dagger right through your chest. You get a momentary excruciating pain. Well, that was rather a blessing in some ways, because I was evacuated to the sick bay, where I lay on my bed all day. Did anyone ever hear all right with that? So I lay on my bed all day. I didn't have to go to the 2 appels where we were counting each day. And I simply lay on my bed. There was another advantage. I completely lost my appetite. And I suppose I was about the only one in the camp who was never hungry all the time. The disadvantage was this terrible pain in one's chest if one laughed or did anything. And my friends ran me round and came to cheer me up. And they would tell me funny stories, and that made me laugh. And each time I either had to laugh and suffer this agonizing pain, or else try not to. But anyway, oh yes, there was quite a decent German MO, medical officer there, who offered me an inoculation. She said would make me better. So I agreed to it. And for some reason, I don't know whether they always do, but instead of getting my inoculation in my arm, I got it in my bottom. And it was obviously a very blunt needle. It was an extremely painful process. And I never had another one. But I learned that I'm not a German speaker, but I believe the German for doctor stabs arts. And I thought, well, you know, they had my arse stabbed really well. I thought it was a very appropriate name for doctor. Well, in the spring, it must have been about March, I think, the Germans suddenly came into our room and said, be prepared to move in 2 hours. And I can't remember how many of us went. I think they simply scooped up the contents of the appropriate number of rooms. And I think about 200 of us got into the train and were sent off to Poland. We didn't know on earth why. And we went to a place called in Poland called Posen or Poznan, as the Poles call it. And we got out of the train there and we marched about a mile into the country. And there we arrived in front of an underground fort. And it was a relic of the days when it was that area of Poland was on the Prussian frontier. And their method of defense was to build sort of underground forts round their main towns. They were about a mile out of the town, and they were each about a mile apart. And we marched until we came to one of these forts, and we saw in front of us a gateway into the sort of underground fort. It was there was a bridge over the dry moat round it, and the dry moat was about its outer side. There was a brick wall about 30 feet high, I think, down to the ground, and there was a space of about 30 feet across the bottom of it, and there was the fort itself, two layers of accommodation with rooms, barred windows looking out onto the moat, and that was accessed through a gateway, the bridge over the moat and a gateway. I don't quite know what the outer side of the fort was like. We never got out there, but presumably they had guns there, and we were led into the fort. It was damp and dirty, and full of every conceivable sort of vermin. The worst of them all were fleas. I'd never met a flea before. Possibly most of you have never met a flea. They're interesting little chaps. They're dead black. They're like little, rather like number 6 shot out of a shotgun cartridge. They're that sort of size, or perhaps slightly smaller. They're armor plated, and you know, start off with, we thought we could squash them. And if you squash them between your finger and thumb, you can squeeze as hard as you like. They're so small and tough, they sort of sink into the flesh, and you open your finger again, and they're off. And although they're so small, they can jump about 18 inches into the ground, off their takeoff point. And they're black, and usually we're doing that in the evening when they came to life. And of course, you lost them. But they were really bad. They seemed to affect fair-haired people worse. And during the night, I suppose during the night, people's faces were most exposed. And some fair-haired people came to in the morning with their faces completely covered with bites. I was dark-haired, fortunately, in those days. I didn't suffer terribly badly. But we had an evening hunt. It was the last 10 minutes before lights out. It was hunting time. And we kept a game book, well, a sheet of paper. We had columns for, where were they? Columns for fleas, lice, bed bugs, mice, beetles, death watch beetle, and various. But it was really the fleas what we suffered most from. It took us some time to discover the technique of killing them. The only way of killing them, in fact, was to get them between your two thumbnails and squeeze hard. There was a little crack like a small pistol going off, a little spurt of blood, probably your blood, and that was the end of it. The trouble was to get them there, because they hopped so well. We discovered that the secret was you got a bit of soap slightly moist, and you dabbed it on them, and they stuck inside it, onto it, and couldn't get out. So you put a slab of soap down, and then you could get them like that. And we had this game bag, and one day the protecting power, who were the Swiss, came round, and we proudly showed them our game bag, which embarrassed the German officers immensely, and they said, I'm sure that isn't true, but it was. Well, it appeared to be impossible to escape from, but after a bit we were allowed onto the, I should say that as we went in, we had a speech from the commandant who said that we were there because German officers in Canada had been mistreated badly, and we would be punished in return for that. Well, it turned out in due course that was quite untrue, and the Germans realized that. But anyway, for the time being, we had this very unpleasant time. And three of my friends, both in my regiment, Grisman Davis Scurfield, Mike Sinclair, and Ronnie Littledale, we were allowed after a time onto the top of the fort, and you could see round the place a bit. And they noticed that every day a small hand cart of refuse was trundled out of the fort across the drawbridge and into a sort of derelict bit of land where it was tipped in, all the rubbish was tipped into a pit. They thought something might be managed out of this, and they watched this. They watched what it was taken out by a camp orderly and was watched by a sentry who accompanied it to the tip. He didn't actually go to the tip. He stayed on the road adjacent to it and watched the supplies tipped out. Then they went back again. And they reckoned that one person could hide in this cart and be tipped into the pit without the sentry noticing. And they got in touch with a young Polish boy who had some job in the Schloss. And what language they spoke between them, I didn't quite know. But he said he could arrange, if they did escape, if one at a time, they went to a certain place in Posen, which he described. Someone would meet them there and take them away to be looked after. Well, in fact, that did happen. Three of them got out, including Grizz, who wrote a book about it. And they each went to this particular spot. Someone did come out and look after them and took them into their house. And Grizz, anyway, I know, spent about 9 months living in Poland, in various safe houses. And I must admire the courage of these Poles, because they got caught. They didn't live a few days inside the local prison. I mean, they and their families would be tortured and killed. And so I really must admire their courage. But anyway, they planned to get them a sort of home run from somewhere, but somehow They never managed to pull it off. And in due course, they all got captured one by one, and they came to Colditz. And I'm going to say, Grizz went back to Poland after the war, and he found the people who looked after him, and he was able to thank them, and they survived the war all right. The rooms themselves in this fort, we slept in this extraordinary sort of beds. They were 8-seater, or 8 lying beds, spaces you might say. There were really 2 trays, wooden trays, one on top of the other. Each tray was about 6 foot square, I think. And you lay four sardines, 4 on the top and 4 underneath. And that was all right. The structure wasn't awfully sound, and once or twice the whole thing collapsed, and the top tray flattened the people in the bottom tray. And of course there wasn't much room. It was rather very much when father turns, we all turn. You were tightly fitting against the next tap. I think some people tried lying head to foot like sardines in a tin. It gave you slightly more room, but then you had somebody's feet in your face instead of their shoulder. That was given up. And then they decided we were rather overcrowded. And some of us, about 50 of us, I think, were sent off to another similar fort, fairly nearby, at a place called Thorn, or Tarn, I think it's called, where we met some of our friends who'd gone there separately. And we spent a few weeks there. Finally, the Germans discovered this story about being ill-treated in Canada was totally false. And so they let us out of the forts. And for some extraordinary reason, they sent us miles from there, as far south as we could get, to a place called Biberach, which was about 50 miles from the Swiss frontier. Well, we were going north to south right across most of Europe. And having got there, of course, we were 50 miles from the Swiss frontier, and you could see the Alps there. It's too tempting for words. And there's a certain place on the frontier called the Schaffhausen salient. The boundary between Germany and Switzerland there is basically the Rhine, which one understood was virtually impossible to cross because you wouldn't find a boat on it. And we were told it was virtually impossible to swim across. It's very wide, very fast flowing, and it's fed from the Alps, and it's terribly cold. And whether that's correct or not, nobody I knew did try to make an effort to swim across. You had, especially when there was the Schaffhausen salient. And Schaffhausen is a Swiss town on the north or German side of the border, and it has quite a big boundary around it of 50 miles in length, which if you look on the map, on a small scale map, it doesn't look as long as that, but it's a very zigzag boundary. It wasn't very closely guarded at the beginning of the war anyway. In fact, it's doubtful even if there was a wire fence, because I know some people who escaped across the border didn't really realize they'd crossed it, and woke up the next morning, because it was crossed at night, woke up the next morning and saw someone in uniform. And they thought, oh Lord, back I go again. And it turned out to be a Swiss policeman. I think towards the end of the war, it was rather more closely patrolled, because it wasn't a little vital frontier. The Swiss weren't going to invade Germany, so they didn't waste heavy troops there, or more than was needed. And that was the area one really aimed at, especially if one was living being imprisoned in the south side of Germany. Well, there were 2 tunnels dug there, one from a hut adjacent to the wire, and one from the camp loo, which was in a hut adjoining it. And the loos in these hutted camps consisted of a hut, and underneath it, for the length of it, there was a long and deep hole, concreted, I suppose, and a row of seats along the top. And periodically, a sort of tank sort of trapped onto the top of a wagon and drawn by horses came along, and they pumped out the contents, which were subsequently sprayed onto the local fields, and you had this frightful smell in the place for several days. Anyway, somehow they started this tunnel from inside the pit in the loo. I never went into it. It must have been extremely smelly. Anyway, the tunnel from the hut broke in due course. I think yes, 26 got out one night, 4 reached Switzerland, and 3 were caught on the frontier, so it was a fairly successful tunnel. The other tunnel was just nearly finished when we got the order to move. And of course the Germans had found the first tunnel and put sentries on it, and the other tunnel was almost ready. But they didn't have a chance to use it. But it was thought that about half a dozen chaps could stay in the tunnel when everyone moved out. And when the German sentries moved away, they could get out. But unfortunately, the German sentries didn't move out. And there they were stuck in this tunnel with the most frightful smell of the lavatory at the end of it. And they finally couldn't stand it any longer. And one of them got out for a bit of fresh air, and the Germans found him. And so that tunnel came to an end. Well, we were then, that was in, we were then moved again. We always imagined it was because so many people were escaping. And we went to a place called Warburg, or Warburg. And that was nearly all British officers went there. I think we were about 3,000 strong. It was virtually all army officers, a few naval officers, and some RAF. And it was a huge camp. The boundary was a typical wire-fenced camp. The boundary was a whole mile long. And there was quite a lot of space in it. They were mainly wooden huts. And there were 1 or 2 brick ones, but we were in a wooden hut. And the wooden hut was built on a brick foundation. But the brick foundation came up about 2 or 3 feet above the ground, and the wooden structure was built on that. There was a brick surround where the outer walls went. And like all these huts, they were the same sort of pattern. There was a door at each end, a passage down the middle, and barrack rooms up each side of it, with about 12 of us in each. And we were fairly near the boundary, and we were in an assorted room. We just sort of found ourselves in it. Two of the members of the room were a chap called John Peyton, who subsequently went into politics and got as far as being made a transport minister. Another was a friendly chap called Desmond Llewellyn, who some of you may remember better as Q in the Bond films. And there was an Australian sapper who was a very good chap. And John thought, well, really, it was a good opportunity to dig a tunnel out of there. We weren't next to the wire, so we weren't immediately suspected of tunnels. We were about 1 away. We were about, I suppose, about 40 yards from the wire. And so he went to the escape committee to get permission. And he was had a conflict with a certain lieutenant colonel who was digging in the nearby hut, who said, he said to the escape committee, you shouldn't allow these subalterns, they'll only make a mess of it. Their tunnel won't be deep enough and it'll fall in, it'll draw attention to our tunnel, which is a much better one. Well, anyway, John argued with the escape committee, and I think the escape committee felt that a collection of subalterns shouldn't be denied the opportunity to do what they were expected to do, i.e. escape. And so we got permission to start. And it was a very well organised tunnel. John Preston, who was the chief engineer, was a very, very sound chap. He said, you must have a really deep tunnel, both to stop it collapsing easily and to make it more difficult for the Germans to find, because they used to go around sticking spikes into the ground, trying to find it. Anyway, we started our tunnel, and shortly after that, there was some very heavy rain, and the Colonel's tunnel collapsed when he was inside it, which gave us a lot of pleasure. And our tunnel was deep. John Preston said, you must have at least 10 feet of earth above you, which meant that the shaft going down had to go down about 12 or 13 feet. It took quite a long time. But the method was you made a trapdoor in the wooden floor of the hut, but it had to be carefully hidden. A yard or two away, you went to ground, and having got down a bit, you made a trapdoor, a wooden trapdoor, which was about 6 or 9 inches from the top, and covered it with earth. And you had to be careful because the German security staff had what we call 2 ferrets. There was an NSCO and a soldier, and they used to go. You could get under these huts. The wall around them, the foundation walls had little holes in about 3 feet wide and deep, and the ferrets went to ground on the huts and looked for disturbed soil, and so you had to be frightfully careful to leave it as it had been. Then one day I remember we saw the ferrets going around armed with spikes about 2 feet long, and they were obviously spiking the ground, and if the spike hit it, stopped with a thump, they knew there was a wooden trap door there, so we had to sink our trap door down another foot, and so that the trap door was covered with sandbags first of all, and then about 6 inches of earth, and so to obviate that. There's a problem, of course, both of lighting and of ventilation. Lighting wasn't a major problem. We used the ordinary electric light circuit, and a slight problem for winding insulated wire, which we made insulated by use of tar and paper. It seemed to work all right. The ventilation was more difficult. We used to get milk from Canada in Red Cross parcels, milk powder, and the tin was such that if you cut the end of the tin off, you could clamp 2 together. Well, you could get dozens together, and you made quite a good tube. And so that was made long enough to reach from the bottom of the shaft to the worker at the front. And the worker at the bottom of the shaft had two jobs. One was to pump air through to the working people at the front, and also collect the spoil, which is hauled back. Well, the disposal of the soil was a bit of a problem. I remember one of the tunnellers thought it would be a good idea to put it in the roof space of somebody else's hut, which they duly did. And I don't know whether the occupants of the hut knew about it, but they did in due course, because they miscalculated weight and strength and so on, and the whole ceiling collapsed, and the whole room was covered in several tons of earth. And we thought it was all frightfully funny, but the occupants didn't actually. Well, our tunnel was finally. The tunnel was about. Well, the thing is, you make the tunnel as small as possible. It's got to be big enough for the largest shouldered chap to get through it, but otherwise the smaller the better, because you have to means more spoil to get out. And every 20 yards we had what's called a chamber, which was about six feet long, about 3 feet high, and about 2.5 feet wide. And the theory was you pull the spoil back on little trolleys or boxes from one chamber to another, and they work their way back to the bottom of the shaft. And when there's a change of duty, and the one lot came out and a new lot went in, you brought the bags out, usually at night, and dispose of them best you could. Actually, of course, the Germans knew there was tunnelling going on all the time, so it didn't really matter much where you put the spoil. And the best way we found was to put it in bags. So a pair of trousers made 2 quite good sandbags, which you filled with sand, and you slung 2 of them round your neck and put your overcoat on, and just walked around the camp, sort of dribbling it out almost anywhere. Well, the tunnel was finally about 85 yards long, and well under the wire, and about 40 yards out into the field outside, and just beyond the light of the searchlights. And well, I was down it at the time, actually, with Desmond and Llewellyn. There were 5 of us down it, and suddenly we heard noises we didn't want to hear at the shaft end, and the Germans had found it. We were almost ready to go out. But anyway, apparently what happened was one of the Germans bared its scabbard, knocked against the tin, which was one end of the ventilation system, and then they knew there was a tunnel there. But they couldn't find the entrance to it. But our friends knew, they'd have to tell them where it was, because we were down it, and the Germans would eventually find it, and they couldn't leave us there. And so we were all hauled out, 5 of us. And well, then the Germans, we were given 14 days solitary confinement. Well, usually that was really rather disagreeable, because in most camps the cells weren't frightfully nice. But in our case, the Germans had a problem, because their own cells were absolutely full, and indeed there was a waiting list extending about 2 months ahead. And the waiting list was growing longer and longer. Everyone was tunnelling. There were tunnels everywhere. People were escaping in other ways as well. And so the Germans had to find a solution, and their solution was to send some of us to another prison camp at a place called Zerst. It was a short train journey away. And I think it was a French camp, but it had a nice new block of cells, which were built on the same sort of system as the other blocks, except there was only an entrance one end, where that was the guard's end, and there was a series of cells leading off the passage down it, and the loo at the far end. And we were the first lot to go there, and we considered it trying to escape on the way there, but we reckoned on the whole it probably wasn't worthwhile. There weren't very many of us. We knew we'd be well guarded, and we knew we'd be searched, and if we had maps and compasses and things, they'd only be found. And so we thought on the whole, well, one would slip away if I'd had the opportunity, but we didn't think there would be one. Well, we got there, and it was a very nice accommodation, actually. It appeared to be a new block. One cell had a bed and a straw-filled palliasse, because we always had straw-filled palliasses. And when it's newly filled with straw, it's really quite comfortable. It's only after about 3 months, when the straw is reduced to dust and squashed straw, that it becomes as hard as the boards underneath it. But to start off, it's all right. And the cells were all new, it was all newly painted. It was very comfortable. And it was really rather like living in a 4-star hotel, actually. One didn't have to go out for pills and spent the day lying on one's bed. We brought enough literature to read during our term there. And the sentry was really rather like a sort of well-trained footman. If you wanted to go to the loo, you didn't even have to get up. You could reach the bell with your foot at the end of your bunk. You pressed that, and he came and opened the door for you and escorted you down the passage to the loo at the end, waited outside till you'd finished, and then escorted you back again, opened your cell door and put you in. And the food I didn't remember it being nasty, so it can't have been all that bad. The food was all right, and we had enough literature. We were allowed out for I think for half an hour a day, and walk round a courtyard, which you could do or not as you wished. It wasn't very exciting because you weren't allowed to be within, I think it was 3 yards of anyone else, so you couldn't have a conversation as you walked round, but you could have the exercise if you wanted it. Well, we had a fortnight there, and really it was the nicest fortnight I'd spent in the whole 5 years. I mean, the great thing was you had a room to yourself. I mean, I'd been in rooms with 16 others, and I'd been in rooms with about nearly 100 others. And to have a room to oneself really was something unbelievable, nice and quiet, all to yourself. You didn't have to get up of bed at all if you didn't want to. And it was the nicest fortnight I spent in the whole 5 years there. There it was, it came to an end, so I went back to Warburg. And it was while I was there, what was called then as the Warburg War job took place. basically there were limited numbers of ways of getting out of an ordinary wired camp. If you were smart and spoke German, you could walk out of the front gate, or you could go out hidden in something. But the aristocrats of escaping, usually German speakers, took the course of walking out of the front gate. It had its drawbacks, because it was quite a dodgy thing to do. You had to get your passes right and everything. And you had to do a lot of preparatory work, including if you were going out dressed as a German soldier. There was a lot of clothes making to do. And you had to spend a long time watching what sentries were doing at the particular times of the day. But there were quite a lot of escapes that way. Then, of course, back to the wire. There was either over the wire, through the wire, or under the wire. Over the wire, I think I can only think of two cases. One is the glider, of course, which never took place. And the one was the Warburg wire job, was brilliantly conceived and brilliantly executed. The idea behind it was there should be 4 teams of 10 chaps, and each team would have 2 ladders, and they'd rush out of their huts at the dark, put one ladder against the wire, pull up the other ladder, fling it over the tops of the 2 wires, click them together, and their team would run up the ladders, clamber across the bridge, drop down the other side, and disappear. Well, of course, that really depended on the floodlights going out, because the wire was lit up the whole time with floodlights. And each sentry box, one high up on the ground, they had movable lights which they could shine on any part of the wire or the camp. And I think it was Anthony Lister, who I mentioned before. He was a sort of electrical engineer. He discovered there was a way of fusing all the camp lights. The main wire ran where it could be got at. And they tried it one day to see if it would work all right. And the contact was made and the lights all went out. But that didn't alarm the Germans, because periodically the lights did fuse. And all they did, somebody went along to the fuse box and put in another fuse, and they came on again. And so if that was done deliberately, it wouldn't immediately cause a concern. So the plan was made. There had to be a diversion, of course, at the other end of the camp, the opposite end. And as the wire was a mile long, if sufficient numbers of the guard party went to the other end of the camp, they were half a mile from where the escape was going to take place. And so the diversion was arranged, and I think chaps threw up grapnels at the wire, the end of long ropes, pulled at it, and it made a sort of clanging noise, and it made an awful lot of noise up there. And the hope was that the guard would all go round to there, and while they were down there, the lights would go out, and the party would escape. Well, it all went very much nearly according to plan, and I think 26 officers got out and over. I think one of the teams, they had a hold-up and it didn't work, and another of the teams didn't get all their chaps out. But I think of the whole party, I think 26 got out. Let me just check the numbers. I think 26 got out, and 4 got away. 4 got to Switzerland. So it was really a very successful one. Am I going on too long?
No. Another 20 minutes or so, if you want.
Well, anyway, for one reason or another, they decided to close Warburg, and so we had another move. I say about these moves, they were, I think on the whole, they were a good thing. One hoped the next camp would be better, and some were better and some were worse. Another slight advantage was that the Germans didn't seem to mind when you arrived at a camp, sort of which rooms you went into. They sort of filled up one room and then filled up the next. And we lived in what we call messes, sort of groups of friends, which meant you ate together, and any parcels which came in you shared together. And somebody, if there was any chance of cooking, cooked for your mess. And one rather moved in sort of groups of your friends. And the move did give you the opportunity of sort of bringing someone else into your group, somebody you liked. And even more important, give you a chance of getting rid of somebody you didn't like. Which, if you stay in the same camp, it was really too embarrassing to tell somebody that you wanted them to move out and move into another mess. I mean, you really couldn't do it. So the move allowed that to be done in a sort of tactful way and hurt nobody's feelings, or not too many feelings. But on the whole, moves were quite a good thing. And of course, there was always the opportunity of escaping during a move. And I think it took place during most moves. Some were successful, some were not. There was one unfortunate episode when we were moving actually to Warburg. A great friend of mine, Mickey Sturton, rather rashly decided to escape when we were standing at the station, and he dived under some standing carriages, and he was seen, of course, by the Germans, and he was called out, and he realized he'd been seen. So he came out and stood with his arms up, and one of the sentries shot him through the head, and that was that. So we had a rather sad journey after that. There were, I've mentioned over the wire, under the wire in one case, that tunnelling was I suppose, the most popular method. It didn't require immense thought. It needed a lot of hard work. And but there were advantages. You could take as much food as you could carry with you, which kept you going, especially if you were a walking escaper, and you were going to take several days. You didn't need food to fall back on. If you walked out through the front gate, you were rather more limited as to what you could take with you. I think that covers Warburg. And from Warburg, I don't know why they closed Warburg. I think possibly because too many people were escaping. And we went to a place called Eichstätt, and that wasn't a bad place at all. And there were various escapes from there. And there was the escape committee decided there should be one tunnel only, so that the giveaway of others wouldn't disturb it. And it took place in one of the main blocks of the building. And they drew their members from it, from the various blocks, so that in the camp, and the various nationalities, because we had Canadians, Australians, and others there. And it was done so that no lot of people should feel left out of it. And after a bit, of course, they needed more people, and there was a sort of second lot who were cooperated, and I was fortunate enough to be among them. And it was a most efficient tunnel. It was run by Frank Weldon, who some of you may remember used to run the cross-country badminton for many years. And his chief engineer was a chap called Jock Hamilton Bailey, who was brilliant at everything. He was brilliant at forging, and he could make keys, and he could open any locks he wanted. And he was a great engineer, and he was in charge of the engineering side of it. Well, the tunnel started in one of the loos in one of the main blocks, which had a tiled floor. And they took up nine tiles out of a square and turned that into a trap door and made the tunnel under that. And it was a very well ventilated tunnel. They had a brilliant idea of making use of the chimney, and that was connected to the ventilation system. And of course the heat of chaps sweating away and digging below generated quite a lot of heat. And that went up the chimney, and that sucked more air into the tunnel. And I remember going down it, you could almost smoke down it without spoiling the air. And it was lit by the electrical system. Well, in due course, the tunnel was ready to go. And there was rather a sinister aspect to it. About a few days before it was going to be opened, a note was found written on a sort of sheet of paper from a book, and it said, the Germans know where your tunnel in Block 2 is, and they'll be ready for the escape. It was signed by, in block letters, a German friendly to the English. Well, that posed a problem. was it written by a German or was it written by one of the prisoners? Could have been written by the Germans, who really was friendly, or it could be written by either a doughty prisoner, who for some reason didn't want the tunnel to succeed, or it could be written by some rather unbalanced prisoner who thought it would affect perhaps his exam paper he was going to take, or didn't like the disturbance. Because on this big escape, it was quite a disturbance for the whole camp. Everyone stood on parade to be counted time and time again, and it would take several hours. It was really quite a disturbance. There were some people who weren't interested in escaping, they were only interested in living a peaceful life. I think most wanted to escape if they could. Anyway, there was another paper appeared the next day, a similar one somewhere else, which said, which added to, it said what it said before, but it said the Germans know where the escape is coming out, and there's going to be a firing machine gun up on the hill where it was going to break, and they'll open fire on escapers. Well, that sounded rather worse, and the committee considered what to do. Anyway, they decided in the end it was probably written by a prisoner of war who, for some reason of his own, didn't want the escape to take place. And that was added to by the fact that the Germans were clearly expecting an escape at the other end of the camp. They were making sort of hides where sentries could watch the wire, and the Germans obviously thought of the escape was going to take place elsewhere. And of course, some of the German speakers were on friendly terms with the sentries, and they sounded them, and the Germans didn't seem to know anything about this escape where we were going to come out. Anyway, we were all told about it, and we were all offered a chance of withdrawing if we wanted to, and of course nobody did. Anyway, the escape took place, and it worked extremely well, but it took slightly longer to open the final trapdoor than we'd expected. And I and a chap called Alan McCall were together. I think we came out about 61st and 62nd. And owing to the delay, we only had about an hour of daylight. So we went as far as we could, and we found what looked like a fairly thick wood, and we found what we thought looked like a fairly thick bush in the middle of it. And so we hid under that and waited for dawn. Well, dawn showed that the wood wasn't very thick, and nor was the bush we were under. So, but anyway, it was too late to move anywhere else, so we stayed there and hoped for the best. Well, then, of course, in due course, during the morning, the Germans discovered 65 officers were missing, and the alarm was given. And we were told that no less than 60,000 people in uniform were turned out to search the country within about 100 kilometres of that area. I think the numbers included most of what was called the Home Guard, who knew their areas very well. And apparently it had become the custom, which we didn't know, that if there was an air raid in a certain area, the Home Guard turned out in order to try and catch any RAF pilots or crew who'd managed to come to ground and were trying to escape. And of course they knew their own area perfectly well, and they could cover all the sort of tracks which escaping prisoners were likely to use. But anyway, the sad thing about it was, unlike almost every other escape, nobody got away completely. I think one or two got about 200 miles away and were out for about a fortnight. But in due course, we were all collected, and Alan and I were collected. We were taken to a local schloss called Willibaldsburg, which was rather the same lines as this place. It was a very old medieval castle with a courtyard in the middle and a real live dungeon at the edge of the courtyard. We went down stone steps into this dungeon. First of all, you went to what was used as the guard room where the Germans were, and you went through that to two other sort of cellar-like rooms where we were. We actually did have barred windows because it was in the side of this castle, and it was built right on the edge of one of these spurs like this is, and we looked out in sort of open country. And we were given foul food, and it was really very uncomfortable there. But what was quite interesting, there was a medieval guard robe there, i.e. loo, and it was cut into the wall, and there was a sort of seat in the wall, and there was a sort of tunnel down at about a 45-degree angle, and there was sort of space beyond that, and you couldn't see really how far below the ground was, but it was a long way down, I think. Anyway, when one started to use that, it had one peculiarity. There was a strong wind blowing against that side of the castle, and when you got up and put the paper down, the wind blew it up past your face, and it fluttered around in front of you, and came to the ground about 2 or 3 yards away from you. Well, you had to go and retrieve it, of course, and one soon got the knack of it. The thing was to put the paper down, then hurriedly sit back on the seat, and that cut off the draft. And then you gingerly look round afterwards and see if it was there or not, and usually it had disappeared by then. And I must say, we often wondered if the local people ever took their afternoon walks round the castle. They'd have had rather nasty surprises if they had. Well, anyway, I think quite a number of us were collected there, about 30 or 40 or so, and we were then trained for Colditz. We knew nothing about Colditz. For some reason or another, people were moved about from one camp to another quite a lot. But if you went to Colditz, you never went back to your own camp. I mean, if you'd been in Colditz, you either stayed there or you went back to England in due course. But you never went back to the camp you came from. So one knew nothing about it. It had a rather sort of sinister notion. It was sometimes the straflager or punishment camp, or one really didn't know anything about it at all, which made it sound slightly sinister. Anyway, we were in training for life, and we finally came here and got a very warm welcome from all the other inmates. And that time, we arrived here in I think it was June, the escaping season, the summer, June 43. We got a very warm welcome here, and there were a lot of other nationalities here at that time. But then they started to fill it up with British only, and the other nationalities, one lot after another, left until it became a purely British camp. And there I spent the last 2 years of my captivity in Germany, but after quite a long tour of Europe. Thank you very much.
That was, I thought, a comprehensive, lucid, and fascinating account of prisoner of war. I thought I was there in every toilet. I was there. I'd like to present you with this. It's a tankard, specially engraved. It says Peter Parker, Colditz, 1945 to 2005. We hope you take it on behalf of the Society.
That's frightfully kind.